So, how can we bring together these different factors into more complex and realistic portrait of how environmental factors intersect with human security and conflict? This is a large topic and one that we're going to continue discussing in the workshop as well as in other areas related to food, water, natural resources, etc., in later weeks. But a couple of general things focused on migration specifically and how they can lead to conflict. We've touched on some of them already with the Rwandan case. This is the kind of simple path diagram from the Gleditch et al. Reading showing the direct and indirect effects of environmental stress and conflict. You can also go back to the Homer Dixon argument as well. Direct effect, environmental stress can lead to people to migrate from their specific home area A, and that can cause conflict in region B because the people in B might not be happy about people from A moving in. In one of the earlier sections for today, we saw the huge flow of people from countries in a short period of time, from Syria going to Jordan or Turkey or other neighboring countries, or South Sudan refugees flowing into Uganda. Venezuela was the largest recent case of people flowing into Colombia, a country that's had its own history of conflict and limited capabilities to deal with the hundreds of thousands of people who moved in quite quickly. So that can increase the likelihood of conflict potentially between people in the destination state and the refugees there. Indirect effects would be environmental stress led to a conflict in the home country, like with the Syrian case, which we're going to look at in a second, that led people to migrate from this region to a new region, and that could lead to potential skirmishes or conflict later on. Hasn't really happened with the Syrian refugees yet, but thankfully, hopefully, that won't continue. So, different direct and indirect links between environmental stress and conflict. The Ruveny reading goes through a couple of different types of conflicts that could be due to environmental stress. State to state conflicts, environmental stress could lead to cross border or skirmishes or indeed wars. We're going to look at some of the tensions related to environmental stress focused on water in Central Asia a bit later on in the class. But when I was thinking of state to state conflict, another one that you might not have heard about would be the soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras, also called the 1969 football war or the 100-Hour War. Basically, there had been several 100,000 El Salvadorians living in Honduras. They migrated in 1969. There was the war was in 1969. They had been there for longer. And in part because of the size of the migrant population, the Honduran government passed land reform laws, in part redistributing some of the land that the Salvadorians were living on to try to give it to Hondurans. That led to tensions between the two groups. Nothing like an international soccer match to bring out the best in us. There were 3 World Cup qualifying matches in the area that led to growing tensions between the fans of both countries. These tensions escalated to the point that El Salvador launched an offensive over the Honduran border. Didn't last that long. Hondurans strike back, and there was a ceasefire less than a week later, brokered by the Organization of American States. So you had migration leading to land scarcity, efforts at trying to protect and redistribute the land to citizens of that country, tensions rising between both, border skirmishes ended up leading to a negotiated settlement. So that was one example of national conflicts. There's other examples that you can think of in Bolivia and Chile in the 19th century. Central Asia. There's a lot you could write papers on if you're interested in. State versus group conflicts due to environmental stress. We've already touched on the Rwandan civil conflict in the 1990s. I pointed to the fact that the Rwandan refugees that fled over the border to eastern DRC in the provinces on the other side of the border, that led to tensions between the two countries. The Interahamwe, some of the worst perpetrators of the genocide, also made it over the border, were in the refugee camps, helped to reorganize, and that ended up leading to instability in the eastern part of the Congo, and indeed the rebellions ended up and taking over the DRC from 98 to 2002. Other examples: Liberian refugees in Sierra Leone, Kosovar refugees in Macedonia, Palestinian, the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, being based outside in Lebanon and in Jordan. That can cause tensions with Israel and other states. So there's a lot of examples of groups moving across borders that have caused issues with the destination state. Some of the smaller types of conflicts, getting away from states, either being on one side or on both sides, are group versus group conflicts. We're going to look at those more in the second half of the class. Often there are conflicts between people who were on the land first and people who wanted to migrate to the area, competition for scarce resources, and different kinds of cultural or ethnic tensions and distrust because of the kind of getting back to the pie analogy, that there's now more groups to split the pie between, and that can lead to either relative or absolute scarcity. There are a lot of episodes in the Ruvani piece in which he looks at different types of conflict and the environmental pushes: land degradation, water, drought, famine, storms, erosion, desertification. A lot of these issues that we've covered in the class already and that we're going to be touching on in more detail. But you can see the effort here, as well as in other works that we've covered, looking at the tensions that can be brought about just by the fact that people move from one place to another. They require resources, land, services that can create tensions in a number of different ways. How quickly these things happen. Looking at the Venezuelan case in which over 1 million people fled over the border within a year. That's a dramatic example of this. But immigration, looking at the British case and with the Brexit forum, it made me think about how the speed in which the population movements have changed had an effect on how people view immigrants and the effect that they're having on their country. And one of the major driving forces for the Leave campaign was to push back against these forces of human globalization. This poster here was from the Leave campaign. And so you can see I spent a year living in the UK, in Wales, before the borders opened to other European citizens, and probably as a result, I found it easier to get a job as an unskilled person with a bachelor's degree. And now you can see from this map here the amount of immigrants living in different parts of the UK. As of a little over a decade ago, certain parts definitely have darker color red. Those are a higher number of immigrants. Often they are clustered in urban areas, but then also in rural areas and places in which you have those kind of smaller populations, like in Maine, that can cause some tensions. And then you see here the disparity in the preference for leave versus remain. The yellow are areas that voted a majority for remain, blue where they voted for leave, and you can see kind of like in the eastern parts of the country, there is some overlap with the intensity of immigration and the intensity for the leave campaign. But again, there's a lot of different factors that go in to any kind of simple vote. I don't want to claim that immigration was the only kind of motivation for it, but there was a lot of press reports at the time and a lot of news coverage about how that was one of those motivating factors for trying to leave the European Union. Now that we have Tony Abbott on the case to try to negotiate it, maybe the UK will get a better deal, but it is one of those multiple reasons for something that you can only capture in a simple kind of 0-1 measure, right? Leave or remain, war, no war, democracy, non-democracy. It's always a tension for how you explain something when there's a lot more going on than just some kind of simple yes or no. So Britain, one example, Venezuela, Rwanda, bunch of cases. Some of you, I'm sure, are more familiar with the Syrian case. I spent an entire semester for the Intro to International Relations class with a simulation of the Syrian conflict, and I thought in linking environmental degradation, scarcity, human security, and conflict, it is one of those big cases. It could also make just as compelling case for Yemen or for Venezuela, but I wanted to talk about Syria. Before I do that, for background, I linked 3 videos in Waddle to provide a bit of background for those of you who might not be as familiar with the Syrian conflict or haven't kept in touch with it for the last couple of years. The video number 1 is a video with Tom Friedman, a New York Times opinion columnist. New York Times opinion columnists are easy to criticize and often are in the United States. I don't know how much you follow the New York Times. They have a cheap student subscription option. They have good international coverage. Opinion columnists like Tom Friedman, Nick Kristof, David Brooks are easy to kind of make fun of as the kind of establishment voices. But Tom Friedman had this series on climate conflicts, and you actually do get some video of people on the ground in a refugee camp as well as over the border. So I think that's kind of brief, visceral take on those aspects of the conflict. Video number 2 kind of takes a step back and looks at it in a more theoretical lens and a way to kind of map in a slightly different way the causal processes that could have led to conflict. And then video number 3 is a current event just within the last week or two, in which there was a huge natural gas pipeline explosion in Syria that basically plunged almost the entire country into darkness. Right around the same time as the Beirut explosion, which got a lot more attention. And I think with the Syrian conflict, it takes a lot more to get that in the news. Even a nationwide blackout didn't really permeate the international news bubble, at least in the outlets that I'm familiar with. So I thought that would be an interesting way to kind of see what's going on and the difficulty in trying to attribute those kind of disasters to a specific type of actor. And there's a bunch of other explainers on YouTube for other kind of dynamics of the conflict, but I wanted to just choose a few, and then we're going to get into a few academic articles that have made connections between environmental scarcity and the outbreak of the Syrian conflict in 2011, which I know some of you are writing your papers on.